to you. It was really sweet, and to all of you who would spend your dessert listening to me. So my purpose is really to try to convince you that astrocyte is a really great target for future investigations. So I'm right now at a Glear meeting, a Gordon Glear meeting in LA. So it's morning here, and I have all the palm trees, and I have my Starbucks here. So I'm ready to go. So. Um, um, so you would see a lot of the images as here in neuroscience textbooks and on journal covers and so on. And this is, of course, an NMR image that shows the incredible detail and beautiful organization of neuronal connections. And this has been very influential also because the whole field of neurocomputation was developed. And the idea between both the brain and the Brain Initiative in US and in Europe was really that if we could map all of these connections, we would understand how the human brain works. And this is still ongoing work, and I think they just mapped every single neuron in the human brain at different atlases. But if you look at the brain, and I'm a MD, and this is how we basically was taught neuroscience. When you look at the brain, it's very clear that it's composed of cells and tissues, and therefore it have all the basal need other organs have. So the brain is basically an organ. And we often forget that because no computation has been so powerful in the field of neuroscience. So the idea was that the reason that the computational power of the human brain is so amazing is because both the size and the connection. But actually, if you look at the sperm whale, that brain actually weighs 18 pounds. And an elephant brain weighs about 11 pounds, whereas a human brain is only 3 pounds. So it's clearly not the computational power is clearly not just a function of size and of networking. It's actually interesting because the human brain had to cut down on circuitry compared to the primate brain, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to lift the head. We already have a lot of white matter, but during evolution we actually have we lost connections as the brain became more powerful. But one thing that has been shown and really gives, I think, really get you to think about how does the brain, what is the computational power of the brain really built on? One thing that's happened during evolution is that the sizes of astrocyte, that's a major glial cells, that actually expanded in area by 2.6 fold. So it's a huge increase in volume of regular astrocyte. And I'm here talking about basically forebrain, so cortical and some of the subcortical tissue. Neuronal expansion is much less. So here we're looking at the cell bodies. Of course, the neuronal extension, the axons, can be very, very long, but because they're connecting over longer distances, for example, innervating the toe. But it's not believed that these long connections actually integrate the information. So it is remarkable that human astrocyte is not only much larger, but also much more complex in its infrastructure. So if you compare it, and this is just a mouse to human comparison, you'd see the area basically expand 2.6 fold. The number of processes 10 double. Volume is actually 26-fold higher in human astrocyte compared to mice. And because human brain have less synaptic density, so a smaller synaptic density, you actually have a decrease in how many synapses you can find within one field of an astrocyte. So in addition to this expansion, a concept have developed in the field, and that is that astrocytes are tiling or they're organized in non-overlapping domains. So what does that mean? That means that an astrocyte totally respects its neighbor. It would never extend processes into the neighbor unless there's a disease in the brain. But in the normal brain, you would have astrocyte forming these non-overlapping domain. And if you look at that as a crystal, it's almost like a crystalline structure compared to all these processes of neurons that would invade the astrocytic territory, basically penetrate them. And this is why you see the incredible extension of the fine processes in astrocyte. And this crystalline organization is, of course, so different from neuronal organization. And if you look at it as a microchip, you can actually say that if the power of the human brain is based on this microchip or the domain of an astrocyte, it would be way more powerful because it can integrate the information from many more synapses than a rodent astrocyte can do. So this is one of the things we are really interested in. And a student in the lab, Nancy Ann Oppenheim, she went on to study specialization of astrocyte in the human brain. So in the rodent brain, astrocyte are pretty similar. There are differences, but there is no specific subtypes. You can find different places. You can find white matter and gray matter, basically, of astrocyte. But in the human brain, you have astrocyte that you cannot find in rodent. And actually, this particular type of astrocyte called the interlaminary astrocyte are not organized in domain. They're located in the superficial layer here, all the way up to pia. They have small cell bodies, and they extend these very long processes down. Their function is not really known, but what's interesting is that primates almost don't have them. They have a little bit, but almost none. And they are lost in neurodegenerative diseases, and kids that are born with Down syndrome neither have them. So they're probably integrating some kind of information. These very long processes look like they are not housekeeping processes. They look like they are basically signaling, but it's not known because nobody have been able to really study them. It's typical they have this corkscrew-like organization when you look at it in the histological section. And I just forgot to tell that the white here is GFAP, that's a standard marker for astrocyte. But in addition to those interlaminary astrocyte, we found, so this is my group, Nancy and Oppenheim, she found that in the synapse-rich deeper layers of cortex, so layer 5 and 6, you find some astrocytes, and these look like regular gray matter protoplasmic astrocyte. They're beautiful, extend a lot of processes, they're highly symmetric, but in addition to filling up the domain, they extend these long processes here that if you look at the microstructure, it's very different from the interlaminary astrocyte because it looked like they have all these blebs here, like pearls, sitting here. And if you do EM, you would find that these pearls are very enriched in mitochondria. It's basically the mitochondria aggregate, probably at the onset of death. And this suggests that these processes are probably very active. But again, we don't know what they're doing. And the red here standing is for neurons. Then if you look closer at these varicose projection astrocytes, as we called them, you can still see these blebbing on the long processes, but the fine processes actually look different from from protoplasmic astrocyte, and you see some like spider-like extension, and we don't know what they are. It's just interesting that they're doing that. So what Nancy did was that she said, I really want to illustrate these different specialization of astrocyte so the reviewers would believe that it's a case. So here it's just showing a movie of multiple pictures, confocal images of the cortex, so we can see the whole width of cortex. And you can see here, when we start in layer 1, we have the interlaminary astrocyte extending the very long processes, disrespecting all domains. Here we have a regular protoplasmic astrocyte, and you see the localization to the vasculature. Here is a varicose projection astrocyte. And then when we exit cortex and enter white matter, you see a completely different type of astrocyte that express very high level of GFAP And it looks like that the white matter astrocyte called fibrous astrocyte disrespect each other because you see the nuclei is organized like not this nice symmetric with even distances, but they can be localized very close to each other. So almost nothing is known about these fibrous astrocyte, unfortunately. They express very high GFAP level and very high aquaporin 4. That's a water channel that is important for lymphatic flow. So does all of this matter? And in a collaboration with Steve Goldman, we tested the idea that if we implant human astrocyte into mice, so basically make a humanized chimeric mice with human astrocyte, would would those mice be smarter? Would this microchip actually integrate the information better? And this is just the procedure to make them. This is not my work, it's Steve Goldman's work, but basically you implant glial progenitor cell from humans right after the mice pups are born, and then you just wait. And how does it look like? It looks like this if you wait almost 2 years because the human glial progenitor cells, they're actually capable of invading the entire brain. And what's interesting is they would differentiate to protoplasmic astrocyte in gray matter, but in white matter, they become the fibrous astrocyte. And they also, in this case here, I think this is a myelin deficient mice, and they would actually differentiate into oligodendrocyte and start to myelinate the white matter track here. But it can be a very efficient protocol. And then, it's, of course, it's super interesting to study these mice. We have done a lot of studies on them. I don't have time to talk about, but I just want to show you how it looks like if you cut sections at increasing time after transplantation of the human glial progenitors. And you'd see that the human glial progenitors start to invade the entire brain and basically expelling or killing the mouse astrocyte. Eller this case here, it's glial progenitor cells. We don't know quite how it happened, but it clearly happened in every single animals. And one reason could be that the mouse glial cells are basically programmed to only keep dividing until, I guess, 8 weeks or so, whereas the human glial progenitors, they are engineered to keep dividing for many years because you have gliogenesis as in a much longer period of time in human development. This is just to show how you really have the extinctions. You can actually see the tiling of the human astrocyte here and how the mouse astrocyte slowly are uh, uh, deleted. If you look at the astrocyte, and these are human astrocyte because we have stained not only for human GFAP in red, we also have tagged the glial progenitor cells with EGFP so we can recognize them, and we are also staining for human nuclei. So these are clearly human astrocyte. And what's interesting is that after the transplantation, they actually keep the large size. So if you compare the host astrocyte, the mouse astrocyte, to the human astrocyte, you would find they're exactly the same diameter in the chimeric mice as are in situ in the human brain. So that is an intrinsic property that human astrocyte want to be big. Does it matter for cognition? Because that's really the question. Does a microchip really work better? And we did, this is just one out of many different experiments. We also did long-term potentiation in slices we prepared from these mice. But this is just one example where we are using auditory fear conditioning that works in that way that you're training the mice here for 4 days, and they would be in a chamber that would basically fry the little feet. It would be a painful stimulation of the feet, and you combine it with a sound to basically get the Pavlov effect. And you can see that the mice that have human cell implanted, they seem to be way better learners than the different controls animals we have here. This is shown here. So here you would see here we have the control animal, and here we have the animal implanted with human glia. And the idea is that when the sound comes on, the mouse that is smart would basically stall. It would freeze and not move, hoping that the predator or whatever is going on would leave and it can survive. Whereas a mouse without human glia would keep moving. This mouse here is much more still. This experiment has now been repeated at least 10 times and in GMP facilities because Steve Goldman is pursuing these humanized chimeric mice in disease models. And every time the facility who tests them, they come back and say, it's weird because these mice are much smarter than what we're used to, and these are the control mice. So this is a very solid observation. And the reason it's so interesting is that there's not a single known that's been transplanted. All of the transplantation are glial cells. So human glial cells are able to make mice smarter. So the question is, how do astrocyte really work? And I'm sure you've learned a lot about that today. And one of the most basic feature of astrocyte is that they buffer potassium. This was actually described almost 60 years ago by a group of really brilliant investigators. They actually went on, Köfler went on to be chairman of the first neuroscience department, I believe, in the world, or at least in US, at Harvard University, where he recruited Thorsten Wiesel, who later got the Nobel Prize. What did they do? They went out and they captured salamanders, and then they took the optic nerve out and stimulated the optic nerve electrically, because all of neuroscience started out with electrical stimulation. And what they found was that if they at the same time put a sharp electrode into, into the glial cell that was surrounding these axons, they found that the glial cell depolarize, so they're exquisite sensitive to potassium. And that gave rise, so it's been shown now by many, many groups over the last 60 years that astrocytes are chiefly responsible for potassium buffering. Uh, so why is that important? Why would you speak? Isn't it just a housekeeping function to take up potassium that's released during neural activity? Yes, of course it is a housekeeping function, but it's also a very potent pathway by which astrocyte can modulate neuronal transmission. So here is a very simple, also very old paper that basically had neurons in different levels, concentrations of potassium in the bars. And what they found was that as you increase the potassium concentration, not surprisingly, the membrane potential depolarize. So, so potassium determines in a very linear manner the membrane potential. This is no surprise, but why is that important? It's important because your resting membrane potential determines how many excitatory input you need to depolarize. So this threshold here where sodium channels, voltage-gated sodium channels are activated, is the key point for generating action potential. So if you are hyperpolarized here, minus 70, you need lots of input. If the cell was depolarized to, for example, minus 55, it would only need a few inputs. So basically the potassium would determine the excitability of the tissue. This is shown here in a very easy example where a group of investigators, this is Balcac, he basically patch neurons, and then he injected a current to generate action potential. And if the slice was incubated in 1.5 millimolar potassium, you could generate one action potential, but you could generate four if you raise the potassium concentration. Just to show how efficient potassium regulate the firing ability of eller the threshold for firing of neurons. So looking at that, you can start to ask yourself, is there any conditions in the brain where potassium might actually change? You think about seizures, hyperactivity and so, but is there any totally physiological state where the brain show very, very different levels of activity of the nerve cells? And of course, that is a sleep-wake cycle. There's nothing as characteristic as the EEG recording in the sleep-wake state. Anyone with just a few days of training can look at the EEG and say, this patient or this mouse, it was clearly awake because you have high frequency, low amplitude firing, whereas you in the different stages of REM sleep, you get high amplitude, low frequency firing. Very, very characteristic. So our question was really, could this be determined by just that the glial cell basically just could be looked at as a lawnmower? that can set the level of potassium buffering in such a way that, for example, during wakefulness, would cut the grass very high, and in sleep would cut it low and keep potassium low to reduce excitability. So we all know that brain state are determined by the neuromodulators, and these are all located in deeper brain structures, especially the brainstem. And many optogenetic studies have shown that all of these are important. They certainly affect sleep, but the most important is without doubt norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is produced in locus coeruleus, here in the pons, in the deeper part of pons. And if you stimulate locus coeruleus, you can wake an animal up if it's expressing channel rhodopsin in locus coeruleus. There's none of the other nuclei, if you stimulate them, that would do the same. So it's a very potent arousal neuromodulator. So two students in the lab, Feng-Fei Ding and John O'Connell, this was a Rochester lab, they basically asked, can neuromodulators affect neuronal excitability? And even more important, do the neuromodulator change the potassium level? And we started out very simple by simply cutting brain slices from adult mice and adding in the bars the neuromodulators we know are involved in the sleep-wake cycle. So it's basically, it was a very rough approach, but we wanted to test it as simple as possible. To measure potassium, we use potassium selective microelectrode. And of course, the disadvantage of that is you'd only measure potassium in a fairly small area, probably like 20 micrometer. So the tip here is about 3 micrometer where you're measuring it. So of course that's a huge limitation. But what we did here was we simply added this cocktail of the arousal neuromodulators, and we found that potassium immediately increased. So most of you would probably say, yes, that's because you're affecting neural activity and therefore potassium was released. So we repeated that experiment by adding TTX. And yes, there was a decrease in the increase in potassium, but we clearly had a very efficient still rise in extracellular potassium here in the slice, and that is just plotted here. So yes, it looks like the neuromodulators can alter potassium concentration. So that is just a proof of principle, but what is actually going on in the live brain? So here, Feng-Fei and John, they would basically train the mice. So these are all awake mice. We're not using anesthesia. They are trained to sit quietly on a microscope stage. They're head plated so they don't move around, and we would measure potassium and at the same time EEG and EMG. And then when we're doing this recording, we would get these traces that I would show a lot of. So basically, we would evaluate the level of arousal in these mice based on the slow delta waves. So this is one of the EEG frequencies that used to basically characterize non-REM sleep. So if you have a high prevalence, the mice are asleep. They have fairly little EEG activity. If they're awake, the power of the slow delta wave is decreasing. And this is just the EEG plotted here. And you can see when the mouse basically exited sleep and entered wakefulness fairly rapidly, you had a pretty substantial increase in potassium that's plotted here. And each of these are individual mice. Opposite, if the mice was awake, it had a low prevalence of the slow delta wave, and it enters sleep, you'd see a somewhat slower decline. And this is characteristic that it's very abrupt. It happens over maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds that potassium rise, whereas it take much longer for potassium to decline when the animal fall asleep. And the data are plotted here. What about anesthesia? So here we started out with an awake mouse. We anesthetized it with isoflurane and we looked at recovery. Also in this case here, we had a very prominent decline in extracellular potassium. So far so good. This is just the summary of the data. But we were still a little bit unhappy about the data because these microelectrode, first of all, they measure in a pinhole, and we are interested in global changes. And also, the deficit of microelectrode is they have a lot of noise, especially when the animal move around. and that could influence the data we have. So we used microdialysis to collect or sample the extracellular fluid in awake behaving mice. And there's a method called the SeroNet method that can basically quantify the exact level of potassium in the microdialysis probe. And it's based on the principle that you perfuse this microdialysis probe with different concentration of potassium. And then you collect the fluid and measure potassium. And if you then plot the data against each other, you can state that the extracellular potassium was at the 0 point, where potassium really didn't change. And when we did that, and this is a collection over, I think, 2 millimeter in cortex, so it's a much, much bigger area we're collecting from, we could confirm, yes, the animal have a higher potassium in true wakefulness, it falls significantly in sleep, and probably even more in isoflurane anesthesia. So that was a conclusion from that experiment. But what about other ions? I'm not showing the data because you'd get bored, but basically we found that other ions, and these are the important cation, calcium and magnesium, they actually also change this, but the change is opposite. And that's interesting because we know high potassium evoke it increases excitation. But if you lower extracellular calcium magnesium, it also increases excitation. So although they are changing in different direction during wakefulness, all the changes are supporting excitability during that. But I would not show it. But we also asked, and this was a student, Rune Rasmussen, uh, he's asked Feng Fei and John, what happened when the mouse transfer from quiet wakefulness? These mice were laying in a nice tube during their study, but what happened if we allow the animal to run? Would potassium go further up during active wakefulness? And as you can see here, he found that there was a beautiful increase in potassium every time the mice were running. And you can see here, this is the running velocity. And here from the same mice, he plotted 12 different running episode or period, and you can see in every case it increased. So it's clear that potassium follow the arousal level of the animal. But how interesting is that? Is it just reflecting increased neuronal activity, or is it actually changing? Is the potassium feeding back the other way and changing the EEG power? So for that purpose, Feng Fei designed this chamber where we measured again, and here's some of the recording. We would measure EEG in both cortices. So these are symmetric recordings. So basically we are measuring EEG in both sides, and we would have an open cranial window, and we would have in this mouse where we recorded in its inactive phase. So this is during daytime. We would bathe the brain with a solution that mimics sleep. So low potassium and high magnesium and calcium. And what we could see was, and no big surprise, EEG is fairly symmetric, and we could plot, this is again the slow delta wave plotted. We could see that the mice clearly was asleep because we have a high power of the slow delta wave. So then we would exchange on one side only the sleep solution. So this is artificial CSF solution that have the ionic composition of we observe during sleep. We would change this to an awake solution. And immediately we saw that there was a decrease in the power of the slow delta wave. So this is fairly direct evidence that the ions itself can affect neural activity because we are not changing the neuromodulators in this case here. This is mediated by the ion. Opposite, yes, this is just a data plotted here. It's a very substantial decrease in the delta power from left to right. Opposite, if we recorded in the nighttime or later in the day where the mice are expected to be awake, we started with a wake solution and we then changed this on one side to the sleep solution. We could increase the power of the slow delta wave. So this shows that ion can change EG power. But what about the behavior? Would these mice actually, could we manipulate the brain state such that they wake up or they fell asleep? And to do that, we did this experiment, again fairly rough, but we would have awake behaving mice we would implant a cannula so we could exchange cerebrospinal fluid, and this is in cisterna magna. That's implanted 2 days before, so the mice are truly awake, and we would record EEG and ENG. And here we start out with a mice that's asleep, and we are injecting an awake-inducing solution, and you can see the animal wake up. The EEG changes to the wake pattern, and we get a decrease in the slow delta power, and at the same time the mice start to move around. And opposite, we could basically get an awake mouse to fall asleep and wake up again, depending on the solutions. Uh, so all of this is interesting, but why does it happen? Also, what are the mechanisms by which norepinephrine alter potassium? And why is that important? It's important because we need better sleep medication, and we also need better way of manipulating brain state. For example, in kids that get seizure. So if we can find new target without causing basically sleep, without slowing the brain down, it would be really powerful to understand what is linking norepinephrine and the extracellular ions. So it's very well known in studies, and this has been known for over, I think, maybe 80 years. It's actually been known that norepinephrine rises to very high level in the setting of a startle. So the startle triggers basically this fight and flight response because noradrenaline, not only in the brain, but the entire body goes sky high. And what is known about that from the peripheral body? It's known that norepinephrine or I forgot to say norepinephrine and noradrenaline is actually the same. It depends on whether you're in England or US, what you're using. But it's very well known that when you get a startle, norepinephrine would basically degrade the glycogen storages in the liver to glucose within minutes. And that is to feed the skeletal muscle because this dog has to decide, does it want to fight? Does it want to run away? In any case, you need the skeletal muscle to function perfect, maximally. But norepinephrine would also activate lipases in fat, degrade lipid to free fatty acids. So what about the brain? Would the same happen in brain? Sure, in the brain, astrocytes are the cell type that store glycogen, and we would degrade it to glucose. It's amazing. All glycogen can be degraded within 1 or 2 minutes after you wake a mice up if you really scare it. But what about lipid? Would lipid also be produced in the brain? The brain is composed of 60% of lipid of its dry weight. So there's tons of lipid in the brain. But the big surprise to us was it's actually never been studied whether the lipases in response to norepinephrine activate degradation and generate free fatty acids. Why has not been studied before? Simply because the brain cannot really metabolize free fatty acid. It cannot oxidize. It's called beta oxidation. So all energy metabolism in the brain is basically fueled by glucose. So people have not been interested in that. But it is interesting because the free fatty acid are, in addition to being energy substrates, they're also signaling molecule. And one thing we are interested in, because we're interested in uh, potassium, was the sodium potassium ATPase. This is just an image to show, this is just showing some Woden astrocyte, and I just wanted to show it to just convince you if there's anything that have lipid around it, it's astrocyte, because the membrane surface is incredible. And this membrane surface is directly accessible to the lipases that are in the cytosol. So astrocyte could potentially make lipase, by lipase activation, they could potentially generate free fatty acid. So very large literature, again from peripheral tissue, mostly the heart, and also actually the kidney, have shown that free fatty acids are potent modulator of the sodium potassium ATPase. And this was super interesting to us because uh, potassium here, so the ATPase would basically buffer potassium. It's the most important mechanism of potassium buffering. And it would use ATP to basically take up potassium. and would take up two potassium, so lower extracellular potassium, but at the same time it would expel three sodium ion. And that means that the sodium potassium ATPase also is the most potent regulator of cell volume. So every time you have a cycle of the sodium potassium ATPase, you'd basically have cellular shrinkage. And this was interesting for us. So the first thing we ask is, can norepinephrine trigger FFA or free fatty acid release in vitro? Because we wanted to separate the cells. So we had cultures here of astrocyte. We validated it was as pure astrocytic culture you can make, and we saw yes, they can in a dose-dependent manner release free fatty acids. Can neurons do it? Yes, they can do it just as well. And in response to norepinephrine, that would increase the free fatty acid release. So does that free fatty acid, would it modulate the sodium potassium activity? And for that purpose, Baumann Lee, she set up the cultures, and she used two different complementary approaches to evaluate the sodium potassium ATPase activity. So one is very simple. You would have a culture and you would add rubidium, and it's an analog of potassium. So you'd add it to the culture medium, and then you harvest the culture a few minutes later, whatever time you want to wait, and you'd simply dissolve astrocyte and see how much rubidium did it take up. The other method is that you look at cell volume. Uh, and you would dissociate the culture, put them in a tube, and then run them to a flow cytometer and basically take a little picture of each of these cells, and you can then calculate the cell volume. So what happened to the cultures? We found that if we used increasing dose of norepinephrine, so we exposed them to that, we would see that the cell took less and less rubidium up. So potassium buffering was reduced. At the same time, and this is the beauty of Baumann's experiment, she saw that the cells were increasing in size. So this is two independent assessment of the sodium potassium ATPase activity in response to norepinephrine. So norepinephrine clearly reduced the activity of the pump in astrocyte. And you can see it's fairly substantial. These are 10 minutes recording. They actually increase the volume by no less than 30% to the highest dose here. Interestingly, neurons behave completely opposite. The norepinephrine actually increased the pump activity, so it resulted in more rubidium uptake and cell shrinkage. So completely opposite effect. And this is, I think, a great example on a transmitter. Norepinephrine can have opposing effect on two cell types that's really mingled up together. But our question was really here, is this mediated by the free fatty acid? So to approach that, we got several different lipase inhibitors, and none of them are very good. But this one here, we ended up using the most. We also used other, and all of this is, by the way, it's just published a month ago or so. But we used a lipase inhibitor called 0079, and we could show that if we added it to the cultured astrocyte, we could reduce the norepinephrine-induced lipid release by about 50%. Astrocytes are always complicated, and nothing never inhibit completely in astrocyte. Neurons are much more simplistic cells, and we could almost completely inhibit free fatty acid generation by the inhibitor. But what happened with the cell? Yes, we could show that norepinephrine as normal, this is similar to before, norepinephrine inhibit the sodium potassium ATPase, and that inhibition could be reduced if we added the lipase inhibitor. So at least 50% of what we have measured here is mediated by free fatty acid. In neurons, we could completely inhibit what's called the sodium potassium ATPase as shown here. So somewhat different results. So what I've shown you to now, and you're probably very bored because this is very, very nerdy, but what I've shown is that in cultures, norepinephrine can trigger free fatty acid release. It activates a lipase that at least partly are driving either driving inhibition of the pump or increase. And probably this effect here known is important because knowns would, when they take potassium up and the cell volume slightly shrink, they would actually hyperpolarize and be less likely to fire. And that could be to oppose the potassium increase that would happen because astrocyte are driving this. But is this even interesting? It has to be interesting. We have to be able to see what happens in vivo. So we really need to go to mice and see what happened when we expose them to a startle here. What happened? And the reason we were interested in that was that it's known that startle in subjects that are have a higher risk of seizure. So if they have uh, if subject that suffer from epilepsy are exposed to condition where norepinephrine is high. It could be as simple as they haven't eaten, their blood glucose is low, then norepinephrine go up. It could be sleep deprivation, but also, and this is used very much in the experimental study, also very high sound and flickering light can induce seizure in these animals. And our question was, is this pathway involved? And in order to study that, we actually used flickering light. And this is just an example that had a lot of attention several years ago. Basically, the Japanese TV showed a Pokemon movie Saturday morning, and over 600 kids were hospitalized. It was the first season. I would stop the movie, you can't hear me. But basically, that seizure was evoked by the flickering light that had a very certain frequency. It was actually 40 hertz frequency. So our question was, is norepinephrine-induced FFA released a key to avoid seizure when you're exposed to a fight and flight response or startle response? And in order to do that, we took awake behaving mice. We trained them for a very long time so they could sit on the stage. And then we start to expose them to light exposure. And this is not normal light. This is actually light that's extremely bright. It's 15,000 lux. So it's corresponding to that you're sitting in a really dark room and you shine daylight, as here in LA when the sun is up, straight into the eye. So it's a very, very strong stimulation. We would do that every 30 seconds. And Yang Su, who's actually a student and a PhD student in Denmark, she would measure norepinephrine using the norepinephrine biosensor that's listed here. And she found that every time we shined the light, we had an increase in norepinephrine. So the first experiment we did was we simply added a free fatty acid to see what effect would that have on these visual evoked potential. They're called VEP, on visual evoked potential in the visual cortex. And this is shown here. So we are basically measuring the potassium increases to the visual, so this stimulation every 30 seconds. And we found that if we added FFA, we could decrease the amplitude of the potassium increases. So FFA really worked by suppressing neural activity as we expected. Uh, Opposite, we could use the inhibitor of lipases, 0079. We would inject it into cortex. We would do the same stimulation, and we would find, as expected, if you inhibit lipase activation, you get higher visual evoked potential in occipital cortex. But we noted, and this was work done by Bauman Lee, we noted that if we start recording a little longer than 1 hour, that sometimes we evoke something that look like seizures. And this is shown here because we basically modified the protocol and asked, are FFA a potential, eller is this lipid pathway potentially implicated in seizure activity? So basically we would do the same. We would inject 0079. We would give the animal, after injecting the lipase inhibitor, we would give it 60 minutes to relax in the cage, and then we would start the stimulation, basically to let it work for a longer time. Why did we do that? We did that because the lipase inhibitors are very lipophilic, and it's really hard to get them to spread into brain. So we basically just gave the drug better time to spread out in the brain. And here we have some of the recording where you can see we are doing this visual stimulation, and you'd see that we trigger some abnormal activity. And that abnormal activity that's shown here, this is one light stimulation here, that abnormal activity that follow is associated with a huge increase in potassium. This is a natural one. This is what we are recording normally. And if we plotted all the mice, we included 6 mice, we found that every single of these mice we recorded for a long time, all of them developed seizures. It took about 120 minutes. And if you then plotted the seizure that happened afterwards, you see some had few seizures, but some had really a lot. So this study has really shown that light stimulation can trigger seizure if you inhibit formation of free fatty acid. But on a more broad term, and I think this is my last slides, but I'm sure you're tired. On a more broad term, I want to propose that astrocyte play a much more important role than we have realized in modulating brain state, so modulating the sleep-wake cycle. So astrocyte are basically instructed by the neuromodulator listed here to to cause these changes in EG power, but it's all supported by astrocyte. Because what happens when you enter the state of wakefulness, you would have astrocyte swelling. This is not really shown good here, and I'm not providing the evidence for it in vivo, but we have measured the extracellular space volume, and we find the extracellular space volume actually decreases by 60% upon arousal. This is in this paper we published many years ago. And that is probably, that increase in astrocytic volume is probably really beneficial for the awake EEG, because astrocyte would, with a lipid membrane, better cover the individual synapses and thereby insulate them and allow them to fire alone and not activating surrounding synapses by, for example, glutamate spillover. At the same time, the higher potassium would increase excitability. But since neurons hyperpolarize in response to the neuromodulator, and in particular norepinephrine, the signal-to-noise ratio is probably the whole tissue is more excitable, but the precision of neuronal firing would be increased because they're hyperpolarized. And this is all mediated, or at least not all, but partially mediated by astrocyte. In contrast, if you look at sleep, astrocyte would be smaller, the extracellular space is bigger, glutamate can diffuse from synapse to synapse and cause the characteristic high amplitude, low frequency, slow delta wave that characterize non-REM sleep. Simply, it's really just reflecting that neurons fire in synchrony when we are asleep, and they fire in different patterns when we are awake. And the lower potassium level would basically reduce excitability. So if I haven't convinced you, and I'm not sure I'm convinced because neuroscience is really neurocentric, but just to show you how important potassium is as a modulator of a very basic thing, and that is release of neuromodulators. I just want to show this is the absolute last slide. And this is done by Andrea Ditz, who was a PhD student in Copenhagen. And what she did was she used microdialysis again. And she would change again the concentration of potassium. And these are all physiological changes. And then you would collect, similar to what we did before, the fluids you collect from the microdialysis and measure potassium. So this is just validating that we can change potassium in the brain around the microdialysis probe. But then she measured, in the fluid she collected, she measured norepinephrine, dopamine, or serotonin. And you can see all of these neuromodulators increased as a function of potassium. I think this is really important because this is suggesting that astrocyte, by modulation of potassium, can basically dial up and down the level of these neuromodulator release that then in turn would affect not only these are awake mice, it would not only affect sleep, but it would certainly also affect the desire to eat chocolate or the dessert you just have, or serotonin, the level of your moods for depression and so on. So I think this is really an indication that astrocyte might play a role in some of these psychiatric diseases we normally don't think about. So I think that was all I had to say. And then I want to thank you for listening to me for so long.
Thank you very much, Maiken, for this fantastic talk. So do we have questions? Yes.
Yes, can you hear me from here?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much. This was really interesting. I have a question regarding the humanized, where you, with the models where you show that the humanized astrocytes in the mouse increase the intelligence. Did you test this in different models, or is it only in the auditory model this has been tested?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a huge literature. So I only showed the initial study because I was involved in that. So Steve Goldsman lab continued with this model, and the idea is to treat various diseases where glial cells are unhealthy. So the first target he had was white matter diseases where oligodendrocytes are lost. So he showed in mice that don't have any myelin, if you implant the human glial progenitors, you can actually myelinate and you can get mice that survive. Then he went on to Huntington's disease and actually also schizophrenia. And he showed in those models, he used a whole bunch of basically cognitive tests. And many of these studies, because it's clinical relevant, were done in a GMP facility. So not by him, but by contracted groups. And they came back and said that control mice are always smarter. And it corresponds to actually the LTP we found was easier induced in the mice. So whether that is related to potassium buffering or control, more precise control of potassium, we believe so. And he had published on that, where I've been helping him with getting some of the data. So it's a very solid observation. We don't know, we haven't counted, so one thing you can ask is, would the presence of human astrocyte, would that change synaptic density? We haven't done it in detail, but the initial studies have shown that the synaptic density actually is reduced in the humanized chimeric mice. Maybe somewhat reflecting that you increase the efficacy of synaptic transmission, or that you have more myelin and you therefore have more dispersed synapses. But it's a super interesting model to work with. But it's also very hard because you have to have a whole little facility to generate from now iPS cells, the glial progenitor cell. You have to inject them in immune deficient mice because otherwise they're rejected, and then you have to wait at least 1 year.
Yes. So I also have a question. Okay. Okay, well,
you showed us that you were applying a sleep or wake cocktail, but you didn't mention what was in it. At first, you mentioned the wake cocktail consisting of the neuromodulators, and then you mentioned afterwards that you applied a sleep and wake cocktail. What was it in it?
Yeah, so I'm so sorry, I confused you. So for the cocktail we use in slices, that was the neuromodulators. For all the manipulation, the mice, so when we put the awake or the sleep-inducing solution, that was only the ions, because the whole idea of those studies was bypass neuromodulators.
But which ions, and how do you know that it induced sleep? That is
We measured EEG. Just go back. So we don't know the. You want to look at, for example, this one here.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So see here basically we have two open cranial windows, and they're separated, so the fluid doesn't mix up with each other. And then we would apply here artificial cerebrospinal fluid that have a sleep. We call it the sleep-inducing solution, and that is low potassium and high magnesium and high calcium. That's the only ion we changed. And then we would, after getting a baseline recording, we would simply suck the fluid up on one side and change it with a wake-inducing solution, and that potassium would be higher and magnesium and calcium would be lower. So we totally bypass the neuromodulator release. So it's only the ions we are manipulating here. And then in the behavioral state here, we are again, so this solution we are injecting, it's exactly the same. It's only manipulating 3 ions, and we could change the pattern.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question. I just wanted to know, I couldn't remember if the seizure-inducing study with the FFA and everything was in normal mice, or was it a transgenic mouse? And then you were just, could I also look at the slide again? I was just trying to think of what, based on this experiment, do you think that you could induce seizure in any normal brain?
No, okay, so the seizure, yeah, these are completely normal mice. There's
Oh.
nothing abnormal in those. The humanized chimeric mice are all immunodeficient. So they're actually really dumb mice. If you have, the immune system is important for brain development. So all of these mice that are born immunodeficient are pretty dumb, and that's why you saw that they really didn't learn the sound. Only the mice that have the human astrocyte injected responded to the sound.
But for the seizure, like inducing one, and also
They're
the,
completely normal mice, yeah. There's this study, yeah.
Yeah.
This is wild type, black mice, yeah.
right. And then now, based on this, did you think of any conditions that would predispose people to have a seizure? For instance, after seeing the Pokemon episode or something like that,
Yeah, I would love to continue this study, but the lipase inhibitor were completely impossible to work with. It was not enough to just apply them on cortex. We had to inject them into the tissue. They basically get stuck. They bind to any plasma membrane in the meat. So it was really hard to work with these. So actually don't see it's clinical relevant. But I think we have, if we could develop a lipase, so it would be actually lipase activator. There's a hope that we could use it as an anti-epileptic treatment.
Yeah, and in line with this, so you mentioned that the free fatty acids had opposite effects on the sodium potassium ATPase in neurons and astrocytes. So I'm wondering if you have any idea as to why that is, and if that would be also be changing or be affected if you eat a high fat diet.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one thing, so we actually wrote about it in the paper in Cell Metabolism, because one of the most efficient way of treating epilepsy is the high fat diet that makes ketone bodies, that's basically lipid. So we're speculating that maybe it works by enhancing lipid signaling in the brain. So that it's probably adding to the literature in that regard. Why it's different, I just know that when people have looked at how free fatty acid changes the sodium potassium ATPase, and a lot of that work is actually done in Aarhus, because Skov discovered the sodium potassium ATPase and got the Nobel Prize many years ago for that. So there's been a big group in Aarhus studying the sodium potassium ATPase, and they described that in kidney, that dopamine and norepinephrine have opposing effect. So kind of similar, that they both induce lipid, but they act on different cell types in the kidney and have opposing effect on urine production. So we are not the first to show that it can be a very different effect.
Very interesting. Yeah. Do you have a final question? Yes.
Has this video from the cells maybe tried to put it into other animals? It's just, I'm curious if you put it into ticks, for example, that take longer for aging, would it work still? You know?
Did you hear the question?
Oh, I didn't get good enough.
Okay, so you're asking if what happens if you put the human the human gliopegenesis cells in other species? Is that the question?
Yeah, like for example, pig that takes longer to age.
Mm.
Would it still work?
Mm. And for example, pigs.
Yeah,
The question.
that's a great question. I don't think it's been done. I don't know whether the pigs that are immunodeficient exist, but the field is right now really developing to make, so basically they're engineering the cells they are injecting so they are not immunogenic, so they're not inducing a response. So you can basically hide it. It's a very high level. So people are really working on that because it looks like cell transplantation is really the key to many diseases. Of course, diabetes is a big deal, and if we could use iPS cell and generate beta cell, you also in that field have to deal with rejection if the immune system will find them. Yeah. So I don't know about whether it's been done in pigs. It's been done in marmoset. They have injected these gliaprogenita in marmoset, and they clearly work. But I don't think it's published. I think it was part of a company doing it.
I was also considering, because you want to use this for treatment, some of these diseases develop very late. Like, for example, schizophrenia, it only happens like in 20 years. And it might be to determine whether they're actually developing disease or not. Sure.
Yeah, also I think some of the target they're considering is the infantile leukodystrophies. So these are diseases where the kids basically get seizures when they're a few months old and they die when they're 10 or so. So they're all fatal diseases. And the hope is that injecting these clear progenitor cells could really cure the kids because also the very young brain is much, it support migration of the clear progenitor cells much better. So I think that's the first target. But other targets could be, for example, MS, where you really have sick and inflamed glial cells to remyelinate. Because the problem in MS is you can treat the inflammation at this point, but they just don't remyelinate. So the idea has been that maybe you can go in and treat these diseases that, of course, are much, much more common than the infantile leukodystrophies.
Very good. Any final question? Okay, so yes, so thank you very much, Maiken. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, bye bye then.
Så